So to continue where we left off, there's another big group of floating leaves, all with small leaves, and they particularly include the duckweeds. But there are a few other things which are quite interesting, things which are all part of the same group of sort of mostly free-floating species. There's the water starworts, which are rooted, but all the other ones in this group are free-floating plants that are just floating on the water surface. So to deal with the water starworts first, I won't go into a lot of detail about these because I've covered these in another webinar. But just sort of for separation, they're sort of small-leaved, but they're rooted plants, unlike the other ones we're dealing with in this group. And the leaves are always in equal and opposite pairs. They're quite variable in shape. The underwater leaves are often quite narrow, but when they get to the surface of the water, they produce these sort of tight clusters of leaves to form rosettes. And they're not a terribly easy group, which is why I won't go into a lot of detail again, and just refer you to the previous webinar. They produce little fruits in the intersections of where the leaves join the stem. I don't know if that's one there. But equal and opposite pairs, often with a notch or at least a sort of truncate end to the leaf. Usually picks them out as water starworts without too much difficulty. Also, a bit similar is water purslane. Again, a rooted plant with quite small leaves and leaves in equal and opposite pairs again. This one, the stems are four-angled and usually red. So often quite a contrast to the bright green of the leaves. You get this red stem and these little pinkish flowers in the intersections. So, as I say, all the rest in this group are free-floating species. A very distinctive one, not likely to be confused with anything when you see it, is the water-fern, which is a sort of free-floating fern with these compound, almost scale-like leaves, often with sort of reddish colors, often goes pink or later in the season. But there's not much like it, so it is a very distinctive things. It's an introduced species and can be very abundant, can take over ditches, but it doesn't seem to continue. It often fluctuates quite markedly in numbers. So there'll be a ton of it one year, and then the next year you might not see any at all. I believe it has a weevil which attacks it, which is probably why you get such variation. But I think it's also a little bit frost sensitive. So if there's a winter with very hard frosts, I think that knocks it back quite considerably. It tends to be in ditches which have lots of duckweeds, which are often quite nutrient rich as well. So it may be that when it gets very abundant, it's also because there's lots of nutrients around for it to absorb. Another really quite uncommon thing, there is a very distinctive liverwort, which floats on the water surface like a duckweed. But if you look closely, it's actually looks like little thallose liverworts, and it's called fringed heartwort because they're often quite heart-shaped, the bits of thallus. And underneath the thallus, it has these very obvious purple rhizoids, which sort of dangle down below the excuse me, which dangle down into the water underneath the little frond. It's not a common plant, but it's often in quite large quantity where you find it. There's another liverwort which you may come across. Again, a free-floating liverwort, which is crystalwort, Ricciocarpus. It has more obviously strap-shaped thallus, forming sort of ribbons, divided ribbons about 1 millimeter or 2 millimeters wide. Can occur sort of as sort of single plants, but very often grows in tufts, sometimes quite large tufts. So that tends to be more obvious is when they are growing in little groups, and often not completely on the surface of the water. It's often sort of slightly under the water surface. Just in passing, it's worth mentioning there are a number of Rixia species which, when water level retreats and you're left with bare mud, you're left with these obvious greyish rosettes. And it's often worth studying of these because some of them are really quite rare, and particularly sort of adapted to reservoirs and places where there's big fluctuation in water levels. They tend to be rather sort of greyish, little sort of disc-shaped, but obviously a thallus liverwort. Two other things that are worth mentioning in passing, because they are appearing here and there from time to time. They're really much more tropical species, but they do escape into the wild. But so far as I've come across, they are a species that will proliferate quite a lot during the summer, but they're not hardy. So when it comes to winter and there are frosts, they tend to just disintegrate. So they're not, at this stage anyway, something to be concerned about. So the one on the left is the water hyacinth, which in sort of more tropical environments can be very abundant, and it has this sort of odd bulbous shape with a leaf coming out of it. No flowers or anything that I'm aware of it in Britain and Ireland. It's not a common introduction, but you do come across it occasionally. And the other one is the water lettuce or water cabbage. I'm not quite sure which is the proper English name for it, which is this one on the right. These are larger plants. They're not really slightly dubious to be calling them small floaters, but because these are sort of 5 or 10 centimeters across, but I've included them here just because they are free floating things, and just keep an eye out for them. But as I say, I don't think they're a pest to worry about. So the remainder in this group are the duckweeds and their relatives. Used to be neatly, you could just refer to them all as Lemnaceae, but I think they've actually now been moved to Araceae, so they're allied to the arum species, lords and ladies and the like. Presumably it's the geneticists that have made that connection, because they're not very like any of the larger arum family. Now, the first one to talk about is the rootless duckweed, which is a tiny little thing. These ones on the tip of the finger there are, that's the full extent of the plant, and here these are, so the numbered sections are millimeters. So it's a very tiny plant, and in quantity, they look a bit like green dust on the surface. And sometimes they can be quite difficult to see, and the best way of looking for them is to grab a sort of a group of duckweeds and just to roll them between the fingers, and the flat scale like of most of the duckweeds will just sort of slip sideways. But if you've got Wolffia in there, they're like little grains of sand, so it feels a bit sort of gritty, because rather than being flat, they're completely round, or so nearly round. Now, the opinion on this has changed, and not least because of the new flora of northern and central Europe. Previously, the plant that occurred in various places across southern England and into South Wales was thought to be Wolfia oryza, and thought to be a native plant in Britain. That has now been reassessed by Richard Lansdowne and others, and I think there's an article in one of the recent BSBI news. It turns out that most of the plants in Britain, I don't think it occurs in Ireland. I don't think any of them have been found in Ireland, but the plant in Britain is pretty much all Wolffia colombiana. And I'm not sure if they have managed to confirm oryza is present at all in Britain. There is a third species called globosa. I think there have been a few records for that, but most of the Wolffia seems to be Wolffia colombiana. And the differences, I'm afraid I don't have pictures of these. They're not easy things to take pictures of. But Wolffia oryza has a flat upper surface, which is nearly as wide as the rest of the frond. And the best way of assessing this is to see it growing in the water. Because the flat upper surface is almost as wide as the widest part of the frond, all you really see is the upper surface, whereas in the other ones, the widest it gets distinctly wider under the water. It's a bit like an iceberg. So if you're looking down from above, there's a distinct rim around the sort of the green surface bit that's most obvious, which is the underwater parts of the plant, sort of because that's wider than the rest of the frond. It's probably takes a little bit of practice, but that's supposed to be the best way of separating them. Globosa has a longer, narrower frond than colombiana. That's the main difference there. But probably I would advise, if you have the aquatic plants of Northern and Central Europe, there's a lot goes into a lot of detail there as to how to separate them. And also needs to be said is that instead of being regarded as a native, I think now the opinion is that it's actually always been an introduction in Britain. Probably came in the 19th century. As far as we can find, there are no earlier records. So it's probably not a native plant. And the problem with which we will come across further on with the duckweeds is that they're very easily carried around and spread in sort of garden centres. Worth having a look in garden centres to see what duckweeds you can see, because there are new ones appearing or new ones being recognised anyway. They may have been around for a while and just not really observed, but I think there are some fairly recent introductions that seem to be spreading out. Another relatively easy one of the duckweeds is the great duckweed, Spirodela polyrhiza. Instead of most of the duckweeds just have a single root coming down from each frond, but the greater duckweed has multiple roots coming down, sort of several roots together. It's also distinctly larger than you can usually quite easily spot if you're looking at a mass of duckweeds on the surface of the water. You can usually spot it quite easily because of the larger size. And if you flip it over, it's got these multiple roots coming out, and there's also very obviously purple on the underside. So quite an easy one to do. There are, however, two other Spirodelas around, and again, there tends to be in horticultural situations, sort of garden centres, or one of them is quite well established in Bangor Botanic Gardens. That's Spirodela punctata. But they're still it's still very rare occurrences. But it's just need to be aware of them, because if they're in garden centres, there's distinct possibility that before too long they will become established in the wild. The other two species are smaller. So we got the Spirodela polyrhiza, the common native one. This one is punctata. It is distinctly smaller. It's much more lemna minor sort of size. Like polyrhiza, it has multiple roots and purplish undersides, but is just smaller. And there, for the separation between all three of the species, you need to look at the structure at the base of the roots where they emerge from the frond. There's a little flap, and it's how the roots penetrate through that flap that are the diagnostic characters. Again, it is because it's not something that you're going to come across for the moment very much. I won't go into complicated detail, but again, just refer you to the aquatic plants of Northern and Central Europe. Go into quite a lot of detail, and there's good pictures to work from. Another fairly easy duckweed is the ivy duckweed. It's very distinctive shaped, toothed leaves, um, uh, translucent sort of texture to it, um, and tends to be under the water surface rather than most of the duckweeds float on the water surface, but the ivy duckweed tends to be underwater, and sometimes you can get quite large masses of it almost covering the bottom of the legs. But usually it's sort of floating in the water column. But they are very distinctive fronds. These are sort of individual plants budding off each other, and not really much to confuse with, quite different from the other duckweeds. So just to recap, we've talked about the ivy duckweed, which is this one here, the greater duckweed, which is this one. You see it's distinctly larger than the other ones. There's some oligo at one of the other Spirodelas here. And we've also discussed Wolffia, which is this little one, much the smallest of them. But there are another 5 to think about. 2 of these are sort of medium-sized, which are Lemna minor and Lemna gibba, and the other 3 are distinctly smaller. So we've got Lemna minuta here. There's another one called turionifera here, again a small one, and there's a third one which isn't in this picture, which is Lemna valdiviana. Turionifera and valdiviana are fairly recent introductions. Lemna minuta is another introduction, but has been around for 30, 40 years, but is now quite widespread and common, whereas turionifera and valdiviana so far are really quite localized. Lemna minor and gibba are considered native. There's no reason why to doubt that. So basically, so we got 3 small ones and 2 medium-sized ones to cover. And as I say, the most common of these, of the smaller ones, is Lemna minuta. So it has small, quite oval fronds. It is pale green. It never has any red color in it. And the leaves tend to be quite sort of dull green, dull colored, not particularly shiny. I think there is a Lemna minor in the middle there, which is, you can see, slightly bigger, slightly more glossy. And it's this sort of dull color because it's actually very thin structure to it, which means that it's a little bit translucent. So you're catching light from underneath, which is why it's not quite. It's a bit sort of paler and not so glossy. Tends to be easiest to spot when you've got a mass. You can see that there's, as I say, you can see there's a slightly bigger one here, and say, okay, that's Lemna minor, so these ones are smaller, so it's Lemna minuta. There are supposed to be differences in the veins, but that's very difficult to see. And really, it's probably easiest to identify duckweeds in the field, and you can see them growing in a mass, than taking them back. Because the other problem when you take them back is that often the fronds which sort of they bud off from each other. So you'll have you can see sort of some bigger fronds, and then there's a little one sort of budding off. Very often, by the time they've been bashed and you've taken them home, those little ones will have broken off, and you're left with a mass of individual leaves, rather than seeing them in little sort of budding clusters. And it's much easier to see them in that form. So the next one, again, a small one, is Lemna turionifera. Now, it's similar in size to minuta, but probably one of the easiest ways of spotting them is if you see a patch of Lemna minuta that doesn't look the right color, that may well be turionifera, because turionifera very often has pinkish reddish coloration to it, whereas Lemna minuta is always pale green. Turionifera often has sort of slightly pinkish or just looks a bit discolored from a distance, because of these reddish colors. And the reddish colors start on the underside. They start around the base of the root. You can see there particularly, and then the red color spreads out to covering often the whole of the underside. They'll go sort of pinkish to some extent. Another useful character is that often several of the duckweeds, if you actually look very closely at the surface of the disc, you'll find little raised papillae, a row of them along the sort of backbone of the frond. You get them in Lemna minor and possibly several other species. The row of papillae, which tend to be better developed on turionifera, those little papillae are equal sized, whereas in Lemna minor, the two end ones are bigger than the ones between. But I'm afraid I don't have illustrations of that to show that feature. But it's another character that can be used to confirm this, if you're not very sure. But essentially, the most obvious feature is the color that's going to pull that out as a separate plant. The other small one is Lemna valdiviana. Again, it's a small plant like Lemna minuta, pale green and partially translucent, and which again gives it a rather sort of dull, not so shiny look to it. One of the most typical things that helps to spot it is the way it buds. And very often you will get four sort of fronds stuck together, looking a bit like a butterfly. As you tend to have two larger ones and two smaller ones paired like that. Very typical form to it. Whereas in Lemna minuta, often there's much more asymmetry between the fronds. They tend to bud off one by one, so you'll have some one big one and one medium one and a smaller one together. This sort of paired thing is one of the things that picks it out as something different. It doesn't have any red color like turionifera does. It's just completely green. the fronds are often slightly asymmetric as well, which is another certainly indicative character. But probably the most reliable character, as far as I can see from the books, is the midrib, which tends to be a bit more prominent in this species than in some of the other ones, because of the sort of thin translucenty texture of it. And in this one, you can sort of see a midrib there and a midrib there, and the length of that vein is a very useful character. That it extends much further along the leaf than Lemna minuta, for example. It's one that you have to get your eye on for, particularly that sort of butterfly shape. It's a but there are some people, like I know Paul Green has found it quite frequently in his county, and it's probably overlooked. But it is, as far as we know, it seems to be a fairly recent arrival. Which leaves us with the two medium-sized ones. So we got Lemna gibba and Lemna minor. And Lemna gibba, when it's typical, is very distinctive. It has these large cells on the underside of the leaf, which become inflated and fat. So it looks like rather than just a flat frond, you get a hemisphere with a flat top and a inflated rounded base. And when it's like that, that's very easy. Often also, particularly later in the season, it often goes a sort of bronzy or slightly purplish color. That's another distinctive thing, which Lemna minor can be green, can have some purple colors, as reddish purple colors, but it's predominantly a green plant. Whereas very often, if you're seeing a mass of duckweeds and you see these purplish ones, so long as they're not bigger and spirodela, with the multiple roots, very often if you flip them over, you'll find them inflated and Lemna gibba. However, as I'll come to in a minute, Lemna gibba is not always inflated, so you can get flat leaved Lemna gibba. Which is where it becomes more complicated, because how do you separate that from Lemna minor? The thing is that even when they're not inflated, there should be still large cells on the underside. You can sort of see the sort of cell structure here. Even when flat, that should be visible on the underside of the frond. But some minor can have slightly larger cells. So there are some cases where questions. The other thing that is, if I go back to the previous slide, very typically, Lemna gibba is very glossy green and quite a round frond. It's slightly longer than wide, but it's definitely quite a sort of almost circular frond. Whereas Lemna minor tends to be more obviously elongate. So still glossy green. As I say, it can have, apparently, I'm not sure that I particularly ever noticed it, but it can have some red pigmentation on the upper surface, but not on the lower surface, like we're looking at in turionifera. So Um, and the cells on the underside are distinctly smaller than those of Lemna gibba, but it can sometimes be a bit spongy. Now, I've sort of dwelt on this a bit because it is a problem area, and previously most most of these medium-sized duckweeds were Lemna minor, and that's the common species, and Lemna gibba was a more local plant, often associated with slightly richer conditions. But it's clear that flat forms of Lemna gibba have been overlooked, and it seems, at least in some people's view, that Lemna gibba is now the more common plant and more common than Lemna minor. But the delineation between them, between these flat gibba and these minors, is still a bit unclear. And there may even be some hybridization involved. There are some genetic studies that certainly seem to detect that there are hybrids around. Whether this is the answer to the problem, I don't know. But I think a plea for somebody to have a go and sort it out properly and work out where the dividing line between Lemna minor and Lemna gibba is, and just to clarify, nice project for someone to take on. So that I think covers it. Again, thank you to particularly the Parks and Wildlife Service that have funded quite a lot of this, and particularly to Richard Lansdowne, who provided me with lots of the pictures here, and given me some guidance. I still don't feel that I'm clear on the Lemna minor gibba problem. And just this one's from Richard, just to show you very often have nice merry mixtures of things together, and the best thing is just to look at them in the field if you can, and take pictures. Probably more effective than actually collecting samples. And yeah, differences in size, color. Lemna trisulca, of course, is easier, but they're not an easy group, and complicated by new introductions, and maybe others that we don't even recognize yet. But there are some that are quite easy to do and easy to record. So do continue to have a go. But as I say, there is particularly this problem area between Lemna minor and Lemna gibba.
Thank you, Paul.
Yep,
Thank
that's
you,
it.
Nick. And hello, Paul, as well. So that, I'm afraid I find it quite mind-boggling, these lemnas. Can we go back for a minute for a quick question from Esther about your references to Azolla? She says it was her understanding that Azolla was a huge concern as an introduced species with no natural predators in this country. In your experience, does it go away naturally before causing catastrophic damage to the surrounding ecosystem?
No, it'll often come back, but it tends to fluctuate. It does. I think it's a worse problem where the nutrients are an issue already. Right. So there's already damage occurring, and when you get huge masses of it, and when you get huge masses of it, it completely swamps the water surface. Everything underneath gets killed because there's no light, and it gets quite anoxic underneath, and then they start decaying and rotting. So yeah, the impact is quite large where you get dense masses of it, and in fact, it fixes nitrogen from the air. It actually sucks nitrate from the air, which is why they actually encourage it in sort of warmer climates where they're growing rice. They will actually encourage Azolla because while it's wet, it will grow happily, and then as the water recedes and it rots, it releases that nitrogen into the soil and fertilizes the rice crop. So they do actually have a nitrifying effect on the water bodies, but they do seem to be they do tend to fluctuate. Very often I've been back to sites which have just been completely swamped with Azolla one year and hardly found any the next year. So I don't know entirely what it is. I believe that there is a weevil that helps to control it. Again, I'm out of my depth here. I don't know the details, but I think there is something that will eat it. But it involves introducing something else to eat it, which is maybe not such a good thing. But I don't know. As I say, it does seem to fluctuate rather than some of the other introductions. Once you've got it, you've just got a huge mass, and there's no chance for anything else. I think there are times when the Azolla tends to die back and allow other things to grow.
Do you have anything to add from Ireland on that, Nick? Paul?
No, I mean, I'm sure I've seen the weevil eating it. It's like Nick said, you can have masses, then a few weeks later, it's all gone. But it doesn't really seem to be too much of a problem here yet, but it is definitely getting more common, so.
Yeah.
Oh, and we've just got an answer potentially from Nikki, who says the weevil is used very successfully in the southwest and dies when the food source of Azolla has been eaten. So that's obviously something that's more advanced than I was aware of.
Right, that's good.
Back to the duckweeds. Martin asked, how often does Lemna seem to flower? He's only seen it a couple of times.
I would think I'm not sure that I've ever seen them flowering, but then I probably haven't looked enough to see. But my impression is, yes, it's extremely rare that they're flowering. Richard showed me a Lemna trisulca flowering a couple of weeks ago and saying that it's the first time he's ever seen it flowering. They do seem to spread very largely vegetatively. Mm-hmm. And they're easily carried on duck's feet or human feet. So they get around very efficiently without having to produce seeds, flowers and seeds. But yeah, I think it's quite rare and noteworthy. If you do see them flowering, it's worth noting it, because we don't really know very much about what encourages them to flower and whether indeed it actually needs to do that. Mm-hmm. But I've never seen anything in terms of identification features from the flowers, which might be useful, but I think they flower so infrequently that it's probably not particularly useful. So yeah.
So you've left us, Nick. Thank you for that. You've left us with our instructions to encourage somebody to become a Lemna expert and work out what's going on with minor and gibba.
That would be good.